Hello and welcome. This is our second short presentation on academic writing. We've already looked at how to structure and what might go into an introduction, and hello and welcome. This is the second of our short presentations on how to structure academic writing. We've looked at what might go into an introduction, and now we're going to look at what goes in the bulk of your essay, the body of your essay, and here is where you present your critical argument. So the majority of your essay will be organised in body paragraphs, and each paragraph should explore in detail one or two of your researched claims or your key points. So we can't be too prescriptive here, because whether you have 1 point per paragraph or you have 2 smaller points in one paragraph, this depends on your content. But you do need to make sure that each paragraph states something, and you need to make sure that you put this statement clearly at the start of each paragraph. And we'll come to that later, how to sequence within your paragraphs. Now, this idea of sequencing applies both to your writing as a whole and within the paragraph. So you need to make sure your argument flows by sequencing it sensibly. And to do this, you tend to use signposting sentences, and we looked at those very briefly on our presentation with introductions, and we're going to look at them again in more detail later on in this presentation. Now, talked about sequencing writing within the whole of the body paragraphs. We'll look at sequencing writing within a paragraph. So you might first make your overall point or points, and this is often called a topic sentence. So if you come across in a study skills book the idea of a topic sentence, this is what I would call your overall point. And then within your paragraph you will write up evidence that you found to support your point. That will be either presented as quotations or by paraphrase. And you might find that you will also have a counter argument within that paragraph or couple of paragraphs where you write up research evidence that disproves the point. So you make your point, you bring in any evidence to support your point, you bring in some evidence that might disprove that point, and you start to evaluate that claim, see how useful it is, see whether it holds weight, holds truth. And we'll talk more about this within the presentation on critical argument. So research evidence is clearly crucial here. So don't forget to correctly quote and reference your research sources, and do keep referring back to our other online programme on referencing. One of the things we find at Pick 1 is that students present beautiful bibliographies and reference lists, but sometimes forget their inline citation, which is equally important, and that's particularly when you're paraphrasing information. You mustn't ever forget to actually reference your research source here. Okay, so we'll go back to this idea of argument, and your overall critical argument is made up of the claims that you're making in your body paragraphs, and these in turn are evidence to you through your research, the information you found. So you need to make sure within your presentation here that you state a clear, direct point, perspective, critical perspective in each of these paragraphs. And to give your writing further fluency, writing a plan, I feel, is essential. And this is because of the sequence of your argument. The kind of order in which you present your points is quite important to your overall evaluation. So if you write a plan, you can play around with how these points could best be presented. When you're writing a plan can be as simple as a subheading and a list of bullet points, or it could be a concept diagram. If you plan, it's much easier then as well to signpost for this idea of fluency. So you'll have a broad idea of what you'll be writing about, and you can play around in your plan of where you're going to put this information. So this is called writing organisation. So at the end of this presentation, we're going to look at some further strategies to support your organisation of the paragraphs. But let's imagine that you've decided how you're going to organise. You've planned, you've researched, you know the information you're going to put in there. You've planned, so you know which order it's going to go in. And now you have to make sure this flows logically and fluently. your writing is fluent. So signposting sentences, they point towards the next part of your argument as you go along and present new points. So next I shall consider would be an example of a very basic signposting sentence. And perhaps more relevant to your needs would be something like, however, perhaps the most important point to consider is one of historical context. Or further evidence suggests that the impact of modernism was in fact lesser than we thought it would be in this particular artist's work. So what you state in your signposting sentence depends on the content of your essay, but the point of fact of placing them in your essay shows that your information is sequenced, that you have actually presented a critical argument. You're building up to an evaluation. So in terms of communication skills, they will ensure that you don't simply present isolated and unlinked information. They will guide the reader through your essay. Now, of course, to be able to signpost your essay, you have to have been able to organise your paragraphs. So there's quite some useful exercise here on the Using English for Academic Purposes website. And if you're worried about organising or sequencing your information, then do feel free to have a look at that. And we've covered quite a lot of information within this presentation. We've looked at how you place information in body paragraphs, how within those body paragraphs you have sort of a signpost of information, a clear overall point, and you present your research evidence within those paragraphs. And that's because, really and truthfully, although here we're dealing with communication skills, the body paragraphs are the most important part of your essay because they present this critical argument. So don't forget the key points here, which are do plan, always plan, do signpost to your argument, and don't forget to evidence your argument within your body paragraphs with appropriate research. And our next short presentation here is going to be looking at conclusions. Thank you.